The morning sun rose slow and soft over Willow Creek, tinting the sky with streaks of gold and rose. The town, small and dusty, stirred awake with the clatter of wagons and the chatter of women outside the mercantile. In the heart of Main Street sat Turner's Bakery, its windows fogged with the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. Inside, Mary Beth Turner, flour dusted on her cheeks and apron, worked with the steady rhythm of someone who knew every recipe by heart. The bakery had been her mother's pride once, and now it was her whole world. Mary Beth was 26, with kind eyes, full cheeks, and strong arms from years of kneading dough. She moved with surprising grace for her size, though she'd long stopped expecting anyone to notice. The townsfolk came daily for her food, but not her company. Their words, sharp as broken glass, followed her wherever she went. "Such a shame," they whispered. "A face like that, wasted on such a heavy frame." She pretended not to hear. She'd learned that silence was its own armor. But the words still found their way in. Every remark about her size, every pitying glance from mothers urging their daughters to eat less pie. Still she smiled, handed them their loaves, and wished them a fine day. After all, kindness was what her mother had taught her, and she refused to let cruelty sour her soul. The only time Mary Beth felt peace was before dawn, when the town still slept. That's when she baked alone, humming softly to the memory of her mother's voice. Her father, once strong and proud, now lay upstairs coughing from a lingering illness. The doctor's bills had eaten away their savings, and each month the ledger in the kitchen drawer grew redder. Mary Beth feared losing everything, the bakery, their home, and the last piece of her mother's legacy. Then one morning, as she wiped down the counter, the doorbell chimed. She looked up and saw him, the tall, broad-shouldered rancher who'd been coming in every morning for the past month. Clint McAllister. He wasn't a talkative man, but there was something steady about him, something that made the air shift when he entered. He wore a dust-stained hat, boots that had seen miles of trail, and a look of quiet weariness that seemed carved into his face. He didn't flirt or make small talk. He simply nodded, paid for his bread and turnovers, and left. But every morning he returned, always at the same time, always asking for her baking. Sometimes he lingered a little longer at the counter, eyes resting on her hands as she wrapped his order. He noticed how carefully she tied the twine, how her fingers trembled when she handed him change. Once, without thinking, he reached out and steadied her hand. "Easy there," he said, voice low and rough as gravel. For a moment she couldn't breathe. No one had touched her so gently in years. After he left, Mary Beth stood frozen behind the counter, her pulse thrumming like the wings of a bird. It was nothing, she told herself. Just kindness. Still, she found herself waiting for that chime the next morning, and the next. But gossip in Willow Creek was like wildfire. It spread faster than truth and burned longer. Soon whispers started circling, the fat baker and the widower rancher. Some said she was chasing him. Others said he pitied her. Each rumor added another bruise to her heart, yet she kept her chin high. If the town would not see her worth, she'd prove it in the one way she knew how, through her cooking, through her heart, through her quiet strength, and though she didn't yet know it, Clint McAllister had already begun to see her, truly see her, in a way no one ever had before. Clint McAllister was a man who spoke more with his eyes than with words. Folks in Willow Creek called him the silent rancher, though not out of disrespect. They simply didn't understand a man who didn't fill the air with noise. Since his wife's passing 3 years ago, he had withdrawn into a world of work, duty, and quiet sorrow. The land, the cattle, and his 2 young sons, Sam and Eli, were all he had left, and he clung to them like a drowning man to driftwood. Each dawn, Clint rose before the sun, saddled his horse, and rode the fences that stretched across miles of open prairie. The wind and the lowing of cattle were his only company. At night he'd return to a house that felt too large and too empty. The fire in the hearth would burn low, and the boys would be asleep, often curled up together because the shadows scared them. He'd stand by their door, watch their tiny chests rise and fall, and feel both love and guilt. Love for their innocence, guilt for their loneliness, the loss of Lydia, His late wife had carved a hollow inside him. She had been the soft voice in his ear, the laughter in his kitchen, the calm when storms rolled in. Her death in childbirth had left him broken, and though people said time healed, Clint knew it only dulled the ache. The ranch hands respected him, but none dared speak of her. They simply worked, following his silent lead. Still, Clint's boys needed warmth, something beyond his stoic love and silent strength. That's what brought him every morning to Turner's Bakery. At first, it was only for the bread, the kind that didn't crumble after a day and carried a sweetness that reminded him of Lydia's kitchen. But soon, it was for the baker herself. He noticed how Mary Beth Turner greeted every customer with the same soft voice, no matter how sharp their words. He noticed her patience, her care in wrapping every loaf as if it were a gift. Her hands were strong, her eyes kind. She never looked away when others did. She simply met his gaze and smiled, a small thing, but it thawed something frozen deep inside him. Each morning, the ritual repeated. Clint would step into the warm, fragrant bakery, nod in greeting, and order the same thing. A loaf of rye, 2 apple turnovers. She'd nod back, never forcing conversation. Somehow that quiet suited him. It was as if she understood the weight of silence, not fearing it but sharing it. One morning he arrived late. His youngest had been sick in the night. He looked tired, shadows beneath his eyes. When she handed him his bag, he fumbled with the coins, and she reached out instinctively to help. Their fingers brushed, and she glanced up, startled. There was a question in her eyes, one he couldn't name, but for the first time in years, Clint found himself smiling, faint but real. "Thank you," he murmured. It was only 2 words, but they felt like a confession. The townsfolk began whispering soon after. They said Clint was lonely, that he pitied the fat baker who worked too hard and laughed too little. But Clint didn't care for talk. He had no use for gossip or pretense. What he saw in Mary Beth wasn't pity, it was peace. Her bakery smelled like home. Her eyes reminded him of forgiveness. One evening, as he rode back to the ranch with the bread still warm in his saddlebag, Clint realized something had shifted. The horizon no longer looked so empty. There was someone in town whose smile waited for him, someone who made the silence feel softer. He didn't yet understand it, but the man who'd forgotten how to love was beginning to remember. And it all began with the quiet strength of a woman the town had never truly seen. The day began with the smell of rain and worry. Mary Beth stood by the bakery window, watching clouds roll over the hills like gray cattle. The sign outside, Turner's Bakery, swung loosely on its rusted chain, the painted letters fading. Inside, the shelves were half empty. She had baked less this week. There simply wasn't enough money for flour or sugar. Her father's illness had grown worse, and the medicine the doctor prescribed cost more than she could earn in 2 days of selling pies. She tried to stay hopeful, humming softly as she kneaded dough, but each turn of her hands reminded her that time was running out. When she checked the ledger that morning, the numbers glared at her like judgment. The bakery, her mother's dream, might not survive the month. For the first time, Mary Beth felt the edges of fear closing in. That was when the doorbell chimed and Clint McAllister stepped in from the rain. His hat dripped, his boots tracked mud, and his expression was the same calm shadow she'd come to expect. But today something was different. He didn't walk straight to the counter. Instead, he lingered, glancing around the bakery, at the empty shelves, at the tired look in her eyes. "Mornin', Miss Turner," he said, voice low and steady. "Mornin', Mr. McAllister," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Same as usual?" He hesitated, then nodded. As she packed his loaf and turnovers, she could feel his gaze on her, not unkind but thoughtful. When she handed him the bundle, his large hand brushed hers, just slightly. "You've been working yourself too hard," he said. Mary Beth laughed softly, the sound brittle. "Hard work's all I know, sir. It keeps the wolves at the door." He studied her for a moment. "And if the wolves come inside?" She blinked, not sure how to answer. "Then I reckon I'll feed them pie," she said, trying to keep it light. But something in his eyes softened, and for the first time he looked at her. Really looked. Not as the town saw her, not as the fat baker, but as a woman standing, her ground with dignity and grace despite everything closing in around her. That afternoon, Clint rode back to the ranch deep in thought. His cook had quit a month ago. The meals were rough, the men were half-starved, and his boys missed the taste of home. Mary Beth's food had reminded him of that comfort. And more than that, she reminded him of resilience, of warmth, of something good that the world hadn't yet managed to break. By the time the sun set, he'd made up his mind. The next morning, Mary Beth was sweeping the porch when she heard the sound of hooves. Clint dismounted, raincoat still damp from the morning mist. "Miss Turner," he said, removing his hat. "I came with a proposition." Her heart stuttered. "A proposition?" "I need a cook at the ranch. Someone who can make the boys eat more than jerky and beans. The men could use a proper meal, too. You'd have a room, fair pay, and you could send money home for your father's care." Mary Beth froze. The idea of leaving her bakery, the last piece of her mother, felt like betrayal. Yet the image of her father coughing upstairs, the unpaid bills, the dwindling flour, they weighed heavier. "I wouldn't want to be a burden, sir," she murmured. He shook his head. "You wouldn't be. You'd be saving me, truth be told. The ranch hasn't felt like home in a long while." His honesty startled her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with trembling fingers, she wiped her hands and nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. McAllister. I can cook." Clint gave a small smile, the first real one she'd ever seen from him. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I asked." As his horse carried him away, Mary Beth stood on the porch, watching him disappear into the silver rain. Something inside her, a fragile, hidden thing, began to stir. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the first flicker of a story she never thought would be hers. The ride to Iron Ridge Ranch took nearly half a day, the road winding through golden fields and rugged hills that looked untouched by time. Mary Beth had never traveled so far from town. The vastness made her feel small and uncertain, yet also strangely free, as though each mile between her and Willow Creek loosened the weight of judgment she'd carried for years. When the ranch finally came into view, she caught her breath. Fenced pastures stretched to the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle. The main house stood solid and weathered, its porch wide and welcoming, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Clint McAllister was waiting outside, his sons beside him. "Miss Turner," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Iron Ridge." The boys, Sam, 10, tall for his age, and Eli, 6, with freckles and bright eyes, stared up at her curiously. Mary Beth knelt down to their level, smiling shyly. "You must be Sam and Eli. Your pa tells me you like biscuits." Eli grinned. "Real ones? Not the hard ones Mr. Harlan made?" She laughed, a soft, musical sound. "Real ones, the kind that melt in your mouth." For the first time in a long while, the ranch yard echoed with a child's laughter. Inside, the kitchen was large but cold, filled with pots dull from neglect. The pantry shelves were half empty, stocked mostly with beans, salt pork, and stale flour. Mary Beth rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She scrubbed, sorted, and cooked until the air filled with warmth and the smell of baking bread. The ranch hands drifted in, drawn like moths to light. "Smells like heaven," one muttered, eyes wide as she pulled golden biscuits from the oven. When supper was served, the long wooden table filled quickly, Clint at the head, the boys on either side, and the ranch hands around them. They ate in near silence at first, the men almost reverent. Then came the groans of satisfaction, the clatter of spoons, the sound of laughter that had long been missing from the ranch. Sam declared the stew better than Ma used to make, which earned him a quick hush from Clint. but Mary Beth only smiled gently. "That's the best compliment a cook can get," she said. Later that evening, as she cleaned the dishes, Clint lingered in the doorway. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face. "You've done more good in one meal than most could in a month," he said quietly. Mary Beth blushed, looking down at her soapy hands. "It's just cooking, sir." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. The boys haven't laughed like that in a long time." For a moment their eyes met, his steady and warm, hers full of surprise. She wasn't used to being looked at that way. Not as a curiosity, not as a joke, but as something seen. She wanted to thank him, but words felt too fragile to hold the moment. Over the next days, the ranch began to change. The kitchen became the heart of it, a place where laughter mixed with the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread. The ranch hands teased her gently, treating her like one of their own. The boys followed her everywhere, eager to help peel potatoes or steal cookie dough. Even Clint seemed lighter, sometimes lingering near the porch after supper, watching her with unreadable eyes. But when Mary Beth caught her reflection in the window one night, the old doubts whispered back, "He's your employer, nothing more. Don't dream foolish dreams." She sighed and turned away, dusting flour from her apron. Yet deep down, she couldn't ignore how her heart skipped when he said her name, or how his gaze softened when he saw her smile. Iron Ridge Ranch had once been a place of quiet grief. Now, because of her, it was beginning to feel alive again. And though she didn't dare believe it, she was beginning to feel alive again, too. 2 months had passed since Mary Beth Turner came to Iron Ridge Ranch, and it had begun to feel like home. Each morning, she woke before sunrise, the kitchen her kingdom, warm, fragrant, alive. The ranch hands adored her food. Clint's boys clung to her apron strings. And even Clint himself had started staying longer at the table, quietly watching her laugh with his sons. Mary Beth had never felt so useful, so wanted. Yet deep inside, a part of her still whispered that it couldn't last. She wasn't a beauty, not the kind men like Clint noticed. She was his cook, nothing more. So when he told her one morning that they'd be riding into town for supplies, her heart fluttered and sank all at once. "You'll come with me," he'd said simply. "Could use an extra hand." She dressed in her best blue calico dress, the one that fit snugly around her curves. She braided her hair neatly and dusted flour from her apron twice before they left. The ride into Willow Creek was quiet but peaceful. Clint rode beside her, glancing over now and then as if making sure she was all right. For Mary Beth, that small care meant more than words. When they reached town, people turned to look. It was a rare sight. The silent rancher with the plump baker at his side. Some whispered behind gloved hands, others exchanged smirks. Clint seemed not to notice, but Mary Beth did. Every chuckle stung, every whisper echoed years of ridicule. Still, she kept her head high. She wasn't the same timid girl who hid behind her bakery window. She'd learned to walk with quiet pride. They stopped at the general store. As Clint loaded feed and flour, Mary Beth went inside to fetch sugar and spices. That's when she heard it. The sound of women's laughter near the counter. "Well, look who's come to town," drawled Ellen Carter, the widowed merchant's daughter, her voice dripping honey and venom. "Clint McAllister's new cook, or is it his sweetheart?" The other women tittered. Mary Beth froze, clutching her basket tighter. "Guess men will take what they can get these days," Ellen continued, lips curling. "Though I suppose a man like him deserves someone smaller." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. Mary Beth's cheeks burned. She tried to step past them, but Ellen's voice followed like a knife. "No one marries a fat girl, dear," she said sweetly. "But at least you can cook." The words struck like a slap. For a moment, Mary Beth wanted to sink through the floor. Then she heard a deep voice behind her, calm, firm, unmistakable. "Mrs. Carter." Ellen stiffened. Clint stood in the doorway, tall and unyielding, his gray eyes cold. "I reckon you should keep your tongue off people who work harder than you ever have," he said quietly. "And if you've got something to say about my cook, you can say it to me." The room went silent. Mary Beth's heart pounded. Ellen blushed scarlet, muttered something, and fled. Clint turned to Mary Beth. "You all right?" She forced a smile that trembled at the corners. "I'm fine, sir," she said softly. Then, with a hollow laugh, she added, "It's true, though. No one marries a fat girl. But I can cook." Clint looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with a quiet anger that wasn't for her. "Then most men are blind fools," he said finally, "because they'd be lucky to have one with half your heart." Mary Beth couldn't speak. His words melted something in her chest, a small buried belief that she might be worth more than what the world saw. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but not cold. Clint rode close beside her, and though he said nothing more, the look in his eyes stayed with her long after. For the first time in her life, someone had defended her, not as a duty, but as a truth. That night, as she sat by the window, the moonlight spilling over her journal, she whispered the words aloud, not as shame, but as strength. "No one marries a fat girl, but maybe someone could love one." The summer storms rolled in without warning, thick black clouds swallowing the horizon, lightning flashing like anger across the sky. By dusk, Iron Ridge Ranch was wrapped in wind and rain. The horses whinnied nervously in the barn, and the cattle lowed out in the distant pastures. Inside the main house, Mary Beth Turner was setting stew on the table, her apron damp from the humidity. Clint McAllister and his ranch hands had just returned from driving the herd to higher ground. Everyone was bone-tired and hungry. "Storm's a mean one," Clint muttered, glancing toward the window as thunder shook the walls. "Best stay inside tonight," Mary Beth nodded, though worry flickered in her eyes. She'd spent enough nights on the prairie to know how quick lightning could turn danger into disaster. Still, she ladled stew into bowls, the rich smell filling the room, trying to calm everyone's nerves. Clint's boys, Sam and Eli, sat close to her, their small hands clutching spoons. "Don't worry," she said softly. "The storm will pass." But moments later, a sharp crack split the air. Then a flash of fire streaked across the sky, striking near the barn. The thunder came a heartbeat later, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. Clint was on his feet before anyone else moved. "The barn!" he barked, grabbing his coat. The men scrambled after him. Mary Beth turned to the boys. "Stay here, darlings. Don't move from this spot," she said, her voice trembling. Then she ran after the men into the storm. Rain lashed against her face as she crossed the yard. The barn was already half engulfed, flames clawing up the wooden walls. Horses screamed inside, trapped and panicked. Without thinking, she pulled her skirts up and waded into the mud. "We can't leave them!" she shouted over the roar of the storm. Clint spun toward her, rain streaming down his face. "Get back to the house, Mary Beth." But she didn't. Instead, she ran past him toward the barn doors. The smoke burned her lungs, but she pressed forward, untying ropes, calming horses, leading them out one by one. She spoke softly to them, her voice a steady anchor amidst chaos. "Easy now. There's a good girl. You're all right." When one frightened mare refused to move, rearing and screaming, Mary Beth grabbed a feed sack, throwing it over the horse's head to blind it from the flames. The animal calmed enough to follow her out. Clint watched, half in disbelief, half in awe. "Stubborn woman," he muttered. But there was pride in his voice, too. As the last of the horses were freed, a wooden beam cracked overhead. Clint rushed forward, shoving Mary Beth out of the way just as the beam came crashing down. But in doing so, he stumbled, his leg pinned under debris. "Clint!" she cried. Without hesitation, she threw her weight against the beam. Smoke and heat seared her arms, but she didn't stop. Inch by inch, she lifted it enough for him to drag himself free. Together they stumbled into the rain, collapsing in the mud, gasping for breath. The ranch hands formed a bucket line, finally dousing the fire. The barn was damaged but not lost, thanks to her. As the storm eased, Clint sat beside her on the ground, soaked to the bone, his chest heaving. He reached for her hand, rough, strong, trembling. "You could have died in there," he said hoarsely. She looked up, eyes glistening. "So could you," he managed a weary smile. "Reckon you saved my hide. Reckon we saved each other," she whispered. In that moment, As the rain washed the soot from their skin, something unspoken passed between them. A warmth deeper than gratitude, gentler than passion, yet filled with both. Clint had lost his wife to fire once before. Now, in another blaze, he found a woman who refused to let him burn alone. When they finally rose and walked back toward the house, the boys ran out to meet them, wrapping their small arms around them both. The fire had taken part of the barn, but it had also lit something new, a spark of love that neither wind nor rain could ever put out. The fire had left its scars on the barn and singed patches across the pasture, but Iron Ridge Ranch thrummed with new life. The men worked harder than ever, the boys laughed louder, and Clint McAllister, once a man made of silence and grief, had begun to smile again. And everyone knew the reason: Mary Beth Turner. Her laughter carried through the house now, warm as cinnamon and sunlight. She tended Clint's bruised leg while pretending not to notice how his eyes softened when she did. She baked the boys' birthday pies and patched the ranch hands' shirts when they tore them. Life had a rhythm again, and Clint found himself listening for it every morning. The sound of her humming in his kitchen, the clatter of her pots, the comfort of knowing someone cared enough to make the house a home. But not everyone was pleased to see it. Ellen Carter, the wealthy widow who lived near town, had long set her sights on Clint McAllister. She liked his land, his name, and the way people spoke of him: solid, respected, untouchable. She fancied herself the woman who could tame him, and she had no intention of losing him to a baker from the wrong side of town. When word reached her that the fat girl from Turner's Bakery had all but moved into the McAllister home, her pride burned hotter than the summer sun. So Ellen paid a visit. It was a bright morning when her carriage rolled into the ranch yard. The wheels gleamed, the horses were groomed to perfection, and Ellen stepped down in a rustling gown of blue silk, smiling like a cat that had already caught its mouse. Mary Beth stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart thudded. She recognized the woman instantly, the same voice that had humiliated her in town weeks ago. "Well, if it isn't Miss Turner," Ellen purred, eyes sweeping over Mary Beth's flour-dusted dress. "My, you've made yourself right at home, haven't you?" Mary Beth tried to keep her voice steady. "Mr. McAllister asked me to cook for the ranch, ma'am. That's all." Ellen's smile tightened. "Of course. I imagine a woman like you must be very grateful for the opportunity." Before Mary Beth could respond, Clint appeared from the barn, walking with a slight limp. "Mrs. Carter," he said flatly, removing his hat. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." "Oh, I was in the neighborhood," she said sweetly, stepping closer. "Thought I'd bring you a pie. I heard your kitchen was rather occupied these days." Clint's jaw tensed. "Our kitchen's fine, ma'am. Mary Beth's been taking good care of things." The way he said her name, calm, protective, almost tender, made Ellen's expression crack for a moment. "Is that so?" she said sharply. "Well, I do hope the woman knows her place. A man like you deserves refinement, not charity." The words hung like a whip in the air. Mary Beth flushed, her throat tightening. She murmured, "Excuse me," and stepped inside before the tears could fall. Clint turned to Ellen, his voice low. "You'd best leave." She blinked, taken aback. "Clint, I didn't mean—" "You did," he said, his tone cold as iron. "And if you came here to insult my people, you're not welcome at Iron Ridge again." Ellen's mouth opened, then snapped shut. She climbed back into her carriage, her pride wounded deeper than she'd admit. As the horses trotted away, Clint stood alone in the dust, staring at the closed door of the house. Inside, Mary Beth sat at the kitchen table, hands shaking. She hated that a few cruel words could still hurt so much. She'd tried so hard to believe she belonged here. But now the whispers from town echoed louder than ever, a fat girl playing house, a rancher's pity project. She decided that night, while Clint and the boys slept, that she would leave before dawn. She would not be the reason his name was dragged through mud. By morning, her room was empty, her note folded neatly on the table. "Thank you for letting me belong, even for a little while." When Clint woke and found it, The house felt colder than it ever had before, as though the fire had gone out all over again. The dawn broke gray and heavy over Iron Ridge Ranch, the air thick with dew and sorrow. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, the breakfast stove stood silent, and the kitchen, once full of Mary Beth's humming, was empty. Clint McAllister stood at the table staring down at her note, the paper wrinkled from where his hand had clenched it too tightly. "Thank you for letting me belong even for a little while." He read it again and again, the words cutting deeper each time. She was gone. Just like that. No goodbye, no argument, no second chance. Clint felt something inside him twist. He'd seen loss before. When his wife died, when his father's ranch nearly burned to ashes. But this was different. Mary Beth hadn't just filled his house. She'd filled the hollows in his heart, and now she'd left because someone had made her believe she wasn't enough. He slammed his hat onto his head, grabbed his coat, and strode out into the yard. "Sam, Eli," he called. The boys came running, faces pale when they saw the look in his eyes. "She gone?" Sam whispered. Clint nodded once. "She's heading toward town, most likely. Maybe to the bakery. Maybe farther." Eli clutched his sleeve. "You're going after her, ain't you, Pa?" He crouched, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I got to, son. Sometimes when someone runs, it's 'cause they think they ain't wanted." "I need to tell her she is." Within minutes, Clint saddled his horse, Shadow, the black stallion restless beneath him as though sensing his urgency. The sky threatened rain again, dark clouds swelling over the hills. He rode hard, mud flying up from the ground, wind tearing at his coat. The road stretched long and empty ahead. Each hoofbeat echoed the thought pounding in his chest. I should have told her sooner. He remembered her laughter over breakfast, her scolding the boys for feeding biscuits to the dog, her hands dusted in flour as she waved a spoon at him and said, "You don't scare me, Mr. McAllister." He smiled at the memory, then spurred the horse faster. By mid-morning, the rain began. It started soft, then turned relentless, soaking him to the bone. He reached the edge of town, asking everyone he passed, "You seen Mary Beth Turner?" The answers came slow, uncertain. "Think she caught the coach east," said the storekeeper. "Saw her at the station not an hour ago." Clint's heart lurched. He urged Shadow toward the train depot, where the wind carried the hiss of steam and the clang of iron wheels. Mary Beth stood by the platform, her small suitcase at her feet, the hem of her dress damp with rain. She looked fragile and determined, like a bird ready to fly even with a broken wing. Clint dismounted before the horse stopped moving. "Mary Beth!" he shouted. She turned, startled, and when she saw him, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Clint, what are you doing here?" He strode toward her, rain dripping from his hat brim, voice rough with emotion. "I came to stop you." "Clint, don't," she said quickly, clutching her suitcase. "It's better this way. Folks are talking. You don't need the trouble of... The only trouble I got is you thinking I give a damn what folks say." She blinked, taken aback. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think I care if people whisper? You think I ain't heard worse in my life? You saved my home, my boys, me. You belong at Iron Ridge as much as I do." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't belong anywhere, Clint. I'm just a—" "Don't say it," he cut in sharply. "Don't you dare call yourself what they called you. You're the best woman I ever met. Stronger, kinder, braver than any of them. You think I don't know how they look at you? I've seen it. But I also see how my boys smile when you walk in a room. I see how that house feels alive again because of you." The whistle of the train pierced the air, long and mournful. The conductor called for passengers. Clint took her hands, rough palms against soft skin. "You walk away now, Mary Beth Turner, and you'll break 3 hearts back home, mine and 2 little ones." Her lips trembled. "You're just saying that because you feel sorry for me." He gave a low, rough laugh. "Darling, pity ain't what makes a man ride through a storm." The train began to move. Mary Beth looked at it, then back at him. The choice hung heavy in the rain. Finally, she dropped her suitcase. Clint's shoulders sagged with relief as she stepped into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight, the rain washing away every doubt between them. "Let's go home," he whispered. And for the first time, she believed she had one. The weeks after Mary Beth's return to Iron Ridge Ranch passed like spring after a long, cold winter. The air was full of promise, and even the land seemed to bloom brighter. The townsfolk still whispered. People in small places always did, but Clint McAllister didn't care, and neither did she. For the first time in her life, Mary Beth stopped hiding behind kitchen walls. When she smiled now, it reached her eyes. She wore her hair loose, her laughter free. She worked side by side with Clint, teaching his boys their letters in the evenings and baking for the ranch hands at dawn. The house that had once felt like a tomb of grief now smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and new beginnings. And yet, a part of her still feared the world outside the ranch gates. That fear was tested when the Autumn Harvest Festival arrived, a yearly celebration in the nearby town of Red Hollow. It was the biggest event of the season, filled with music, dancing, pie contests, and neighbors from miles around. "Come with us," Clint said one morning, leaning against the kitchen door frame. Mary Beth froze, wiping flour from her hands. "Me? No, I couldn't. Everyone in town will be there." "That's the point," he said with a slow grin. "Time folks saw what I already know, that you're the heart of Iron Ridge." Her stomach knotted. "They'll stare. They always do." "Then let 'em," he replied softly. "You got nothing to be ashamed of." It took all her courage, but when the festival day came, she dressed carefully, a soft blue gown that matched the sky, one she'd sewn herself. Clint waited outside the house, wearing his best hat, his boys scrubbed clean and beaming. When she stepped out, he went utterly still. "Mary Beth," he murmured. "You look beautiful," she blushed, lowering her gaze. "Don't tease me." "I ain't," he said, his voice warm. "Not ever." The town square was alive with color and sound, fiddles playing, children chasing ribbons, the scent of roasted corn and baked apples filling the air. Heads turned as Clint and Mary Beth walked in together. Some people smiled politely. Others whispered. Ellen Carter was among them, standing near the pie table, her expression tight as polished glass. Mary Beth felt her palms grow damp, but Clint reached for her hand, steady and sure. "Ignore 'em," he said quietly. "Look at me." So she did, and somehow the rest of the world faded. They entered the pie contest together, Mary Beth's apple cinnamon creation drawing nods of approval even before judging began. When the ribbons were finally awarded, the announcer's voice rang out clear. "First prize, Miss Mary Beth Turner of Iron Ridge." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ellen's smile faltered. Mary Beth stood frozen, stunned as people began to applaud. Clint gave her a gentle nudge. "Go on, sweetheart." She stepped forward to accept the blue ribbon, cheeks flushed with disbelief. But before she could retreat, Clint climbed up onto the small stage beside her. "Folks," he said, removing his hat. "I got something to say." The chatter died down instantly. All eyes turned toward him. "I know there's been talk," Clint began, his voice carrying across the square. "Talk about me, about this woman here. Some of you don't understand what she means to me. And that's fine. You don't have to. But I'm going to make it plain." He turned to Mary Beth, his eyes steady and full of fire. "This woman saved my home when I'd near lost it. She's raised my boys better than I ever could alone. And she's got a heart bigger than this whole town put together." Mary Beth's breath caught. "Clint." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small ring from his coat pocket. Simple, silver, shining like morning light. "They said no one marries a fat girl," he said softly, so only she could hear. "But I ain't no one. I'm a man who knows worth when he sees it. Marry me, Mary Beth Turner." Tears blurred her vision. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she nodded, choking out a laugh that sounded half like a sob. "Yes, Clint. 1,000 times yes." The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, and even a few tears. The boys whooped and ran up to hug her. For the first time in her life, Mary Beth didn't feel small, didn't feel hidden. She felt seen. As Clint slid the ring onto her finger, he whispered, "Told you. Let 'em talk. We'll give 'em something worth talking about." And when he kissed her there in the middle of Red Hollow, under the autumn sun, The whispers finally turned to smiles. The following weeks after the Harvest Festival felt like a dream Mary Beth Turner never wanted to wake from. The blue ribbon from the pie contest still hung proudly in the kitchen, but it wasn't the prize that made her heart flutter. It was the ring on her finger. Every time the sunlight caught it, she felt the warmth of Clint McAllister's voice echo in her heart. They said no one marries a fat girl, but I ain't no one. The gossip in Red Hollow didn't stop overnight. Whispers still drifted through the general store and around the churchyard. Folks wondering what kind of man would choose a woman like her. But Clint never flinched. Every Sunday, he held her hand as they walked through town, shoulders squared and chin high, his boys skipping ahead. That quiet, steady pride spoke louder than 1,000 defenses, and soon even the whispers changed. Mary Beth had been right all along. The way to a town's heart was through its stomach. Her pies became a local favorite, and her kindness softened even the harshest tongues. When an old widow fell sick, Mary Beth brought her soup. When a neighbor's wife had a baby, she baked them bread. The people who once looked at her with pity began to look at her with respect. At the ranch, life found a new rhythm, warm, lively, and full of laughter. Morning started early with Clint's deep voice calling from the barn and the boys rushing about, their boots clattering across the porch. Mary Beth would step outside with coffee in hand, her hair wrapped in a kerchief, smiling at the sight of Clint wrestling a stubborn calf or teaching Eli to tie a proper knot. She was no longer the woman who hid in kitchens. She was his wife, their mother, the heart of Iron Ridge. The wedding itself had been simple, a gathering under the cottonwood tree behind the house, the one that survived the fire. Mary Beth wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, and Clint wore his cleanest shirt and that same stubborn smile she loved. Sam and Eli had walked her down the aisle, proud as princes. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Clint did so with all the tenderness of a man who'd finally come home. The ranch hands cheered, the horses neighed as though in approval, and the sky seemed wider that day, blue and endless like the future ahead. That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns burned low, Mary Beth stood by the window, looking out at the ranch she now called hers. The barn had been rebuilt, the fields green again. She thought of all the roads that had brought her here, the cruel words, the lonely nights, the hunger to be seen, and she realized that every hardship had carved a place in her heart for this joy to fit into. Clint came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking, sweetheart?" She leaned back against him, smiling softly. "Just that I never thought I'd end up here. Loved, wanted, home." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You were always all that, Mary Beth. Took me a while to deserve it is all." She turned, resting a hand on his cheek. "Clint McAllister, you're the only man who ever looked at me and saw more than what folks said I was." He smiled. That quiet, steady smile that still melted her. "Reckon I just had better eyes." Outside, the wind carried the sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, crickets singing, the boys' soft laughter drifting from their room. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting golden light over the walls. Mary Beth felt tears sting her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from peace, the kind she'd never known before. The kind that whispered, "You belong." She took Clint's hand and led him toward the kitchen, where a fresh pie waited on the table. "One last slice before bed?" she teased. He chuckled. "Woman, you're gonna spoil me," she winked. "That's the plan, Mr. McAllister," as they sat together, sharing pie and laughter. The house hummed with warmth, not just from the fire, but from love. Hard-earned and deeply rooted. For the first time in her life, Mary Beth Turner wasn't the fat girl or the baker's daughter. She was Mary Beth McAllister, wife, mother, and the heart of a home built not from wood and nails, but from courage, kindness, and second chances. And when Clint reached across the table, taking her hand and saying softly, "Welcome home, darling," she knew that she already was.